There was no running water or gas supply, and the room was lit by old glass spirit lamps. It was an amateur's laboratory, an enthusiast's collection of stained beakers and test tubes and rudimentary chemicals. The room smelled of ammonia. The table on which he worked was stained with spillage from the previous efforts, and probably from ink. He was surrounded by landscape paintings and early photographs, and by jugs and mugs and other domestic trinkets that were as alien to a laboratory as delicate soda crystals were to any other house in this smoky residential neighbourhood. It was an unexpected setting for one of chemistry's most romantic and significant moments. That is a quote from chapter 3 of Simon Garfield's book that I won't quite yet name because we're going to slightly tease you with the topic of this episode of Stories in Colour. So welcome to the podcast here at the National Gallery in London, where we are searching for the secret histories of how colour has changed the world. Our colour today, as our opening quotation refers to, did truly alter the course of chemical history, and it was discovered by a teenager, completely by accident. This humble dye instigated a fashion trend led by an empress and a queen, started a commercial race to produce synthetic pigments, and indirectly led to huge advances in modern medicine, explosives, photography, and plastics. I'm Beks from the digital department here at the gallery, and joining me back on the podcast today to talk about this very particular purple is Kassia St Clair.
Thank you so much for having me back.
We are delighted to have you back. For listeners who haven't yet listened to your previous episode on Deadly Greens with us, we'll just share a little bit about who you are. So yes, Kassia is an acclaimed British writer and cultural historian who specialises in telling illuminating stories about the overlooked and the everyday. Her books include The Secret Lives of Colour, which was a Sunday Times top 10 bestseller and BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week. So we're getting into this elusive purple dye, and we had this scene setting in Simon Garfield's book of a romantic and significant moment. What was happening?
So at the heart of this story is a man called William Henry Perkin, and he's the person who makes this momentous discovery. And if you Google his name, you usually come up with a series of portraits and images of him from around 1900, so well after he's making this discovery. And he's an old man, he's very distinguished, typical Victorian gentleman with a beard. And I always feel this is such a shame because actually this is an incredible story of a teenager, a very, admittedly an incredibly bright teenager making a momentous discovery in either his father's shed or his father's attic. I've heard both different accounts. But so William Henry Perkin, he was born in 1838 and he's a British chemist. He is born in the East End of London, in Shadwell, and his father's a builder. But he is incredibly precocious, a really sort of, although he does a few different things as a boy, it's pretty evident by the time he's a teenager that he's a gifted chemist. He's sent to the Royal College of Chemistry when he's just 15. And he becomes a student of a pretty well-known chemist called August Wilhelm Hofmann. And Hofmann is really interested in coal tar, which is a byproduct of coal processing that's really rich in hydrocarbons. And Hofmann has been sort of doing various different experiments, and as part of his tutelage of the now 18-year-old William Henry Perkin, he sets him the task of synthesizing quinine, which would have been a real coup for any chemist. It would have been a real kind of chemical miracle. At the time, lots of people are getting malaria, both within Europe but also across the world. And it's costing people a lot of money if you are sending an army elsewhere, or if you've got traders going to different parts of the world. Lots and lots of people are falling sick because of malaria. And the only cure for it is quinine, which is extracted from a tree. And, it's very expensive. And so the thought of being able to synthesize quinine from, a byproduct of coal is really appealing. And
by synthesize, we mean creating something chemically rather than naturally.
Exactly. So, this is an era where lots of chemists are trying to synthesize natural products in labs. This cuts out a lot of pesky trade routes and issues you can have. And particularly if you're trying to synthesize a synthetic version of a crop, that has a lot of benefits. For example, if a crop fails because of bad weather, suddenly you don't have your supply of madder or quinine or whatever it is that you're growing as a crop. If you can make it in a lab, you've got far more control over the raw materials, and you can make sure that you've got a constant supply. And so the idea that you can create synthetic variants of naturally occurring products is really appealing to people, and clearly has a lot of commercial benefit. And so that is what is set this young boy, aged 18, by his chemistry teacher. I don't know how much hope he had for success for William Henry Perkin. I think maybe he just set it as a kind of thing to do during the school holidays, but nevertheless, off he toddles to his father's house in Shadwell and begins looking at coal tar, experimenting with it, and trying to see if he can create quinine, which, important to note, would have been a colourless liquid.
And so we're really at the beginning here, aren't we, of modern chemistry and industrialisation. It's this, quite a potent moment. You've set the stage with a quinine being clear, being an uncoloured liquid. We're going to get to a purple dye. What purple dyes have been around before this point that would have been popular or used to dye clothes, etc.?
So when you look at the history of colour, and in particular the history of purple, the story that immediately comes to mind, or the dye that immediately comes to mind, is Tyrian purple, which was the preeminent dye of the ancient world and was incredibly sought after, incredibly popular. It's made from two different types of sea snails that are native to the Mediterranean, and really became a hugely powerful symbolic signifier of wealth and power in the ancient world. Because it took an awful lot of sea snails to make, a fairly small amount of dye, it was really expensive. It was also very bright and vibrant. And so its use is restricted, economically, because not that many people can afford it. But also people start putting, legal restrictions on it as well. So it starts becoming restricted to certain grades in the Roman army, for example, and eventually is restricted to, just the imperial family. And eventually it becomes so expensive that you even find accounts of Roman emperors kind of complaining that they can't afford it anymore as the sea snails become more and more scarce because they're all being killed off to make this dye. But this Tyrian purple dye really is has this incredibly long tail. I think when we think about the colours of royalty in the West, if you ask people to sort of think about what colour they believe is most associated with royalty, purple is probably the one that comes up first.
Yes.
And that's because of this very long cultural memory and association that we have between purple and royalty, and that is down to this Tyrian purple. Yeah.
We actually have done an episode on Tyrian purple, so you can go back and listen to that if you would like to, with Victoria Finlay, who's travelled to the part of the world where the sea snails are from, and you can hear more about that story of that very royal coloured purple. So yes, we've set the stage for why perhaps a new purple dye that was a little bit cheaper might be an interesting thing to people. And we've also set the stage of William Perkin in his father's house doing some chemical experiments. What was his accidental discovery?
I mean, yes, we have set the stage. And I think it's important to say how much appetite there was. People really were trying desperately to create a kind of new version of a purple that could be commercially viable. I mean, I think there was a really popular purple very briefly in the mid 1800s, so just before William Henry Perkin creates his colour, but it was made from Peruvian guano. That's, bird poop.
Okay.
That's how desperate people were to find an alternative purple. So this is relevant. So William Henry Perkin is desperately trying to make quinine. He's
not thinking about purple at all.
Not thinking about purple at all. Thinking about a colourless liquid, and he's hoping that he can combine two particular molecules, hydrocarbons, that are very prevalent in coal tar with some oxygen, and this will create quinine. So he does a kind of initial stage of his experiment and does not find in his test tube a wonderful clear liquid that might be quinine. Instead, he finds a kind of reddish brown sludge. And I think most chemists would kind of think, okay, this is a failed experiment. I'm not on the right track here. I'm just going to throw this errant slop away and start again. But instead, maybe because he's less jaded, he's young, maybe he's just a natural optimist, maybe it's curiosity, we don't know why. But instead, he kind of keeps on experimenting with it. And so it takes this unappetizing looking sludge as his starting point and does a further extraction and ends up with a black solid. And again, he keeps on going. He then dissolves this black solid in some methylated spirits and ends up with a really vibrant purple liquid. It's not what he's looking for. It's not quinine. It's not what he wants. But he's curious.
Yes.
And he has a little bit of background as, he's done some artwork. And so he starts looking into the properties of this purple liquid. And one of the things he does is dip some fabric into it. And he sees that actually what he has created seems to be a really interesting purple dye. It seems to retain its colour quite well in light, which is always a big test. You want, obviously, if people are going to be putting on clothes or making curtains out of something and it's going to be exposed to light, you don't want it to fade very quickly. And that's a real problem that a lot of dyes have. So the initial experiments are really encouraging, and he starts by sending some sample, creating a little bit more and sending some samples to some more experienced dyers to ask what they think.
It's amazing, isn't it, that he has this almost foresight. I guess he can't have seen where this would go, which we'll get to, but he doesn't stop with the sort of sludge. He keeps trying, he keeps experimenting with it and gets this glorious purple. And I do think, your reference that he was kind of a little bit interested in art and painting, maybe that feeds into why, I don't know, maybe he has some interest in colour, or perhaps the purple attracts him for that reason. But
I do find him really interesting as a character subject.
Definitely.
I mean, it's partly because you only see images of him as an older man and he looks very kind of calm, and when you read his speeches, they're not page turners. they're quite staid Victorian gentlemen, I'm talking about chemistry speeches. And yet what is revealed by this time in his life is a really strong, precocious, self-confident, stubborn character. He's been set this specific task by a well-known chemist. He's very young. He's experimenting, in a kind of informal laboratory in his father's house. His father, is a builder, and this is, this kind of his skill in chemistry, the interest in him of this, quite well-known chemist, is a really significant thing. I think if it was most people, you'd want to persevere. You'd be really trying to make quinine, and that would be
your one objective.
Yes, you'd be focused. This is your ticket out of here.
Pleasing your teacher.
Yeah,
that's your task.
But that is clearly not who this man is, and I find the contrast between what we see of him in his portraits and what we see of him in his speeches, but and what this moment reveals about him as a character, really fascinating.
So what actually is this dye, and what does he call it?
So it goes through a few different names. Again, there's sort of a kind of marketing angle to this. But it's essentially what he's created, without realising it, is the first aniline dye, which will, open up, new branches of chemistry and give birth, its discovery will give birth to the creation of a whole family of different dyes that will be incredibly commercially successful. He will discover a fair few of them, but lots of other chemists will across Europe as well. And it really will be hugely significant, which is part of the reason why you have all these portraits and speeches of him, around 1900, because by that time, this discovery has really been recognised for what it is, for how momentous it is. But, back in 1856, when he's, making this discovery, he doesn't quite realise what he's created is something so new. But what he does think is, okay, this seems to be a really useful, potent dye of a particular colour that people are desperate for, that has these amazing references with the preeminent dye of the ancient world, Tyrian purple. And, I think I should give this a go. So he's sending off samples, and he begins to get back definitely mixed reviews, but some initial quite encouraging noises from dyers. And this is enough to kind of set him off on a path that, will help change the world.
It's amazing, isn't it? So we've got this aniline dye, which is a starting material for lots of industrial chemical products, including synthetic dyes and agricultural chemicals. And it can be extracted from coal tar, and that's a really big, obviously, waste product in the 19th century, coal being such a crucial part of the Industrial Revolution. And that made it really readily available to chemists, didn't it, like Perkins? And so he has this inquiring mind. He's going on this journey with purple and this purple dye and sending it to more experienced dyers, and he names it and patents it, doesn't he?
Yeah, he patents it sort of really quite early on. I think he's still only 18 when he patents the colour. And I think there's some legal questions, because I think in theory you're meant to be 21 before you file a patent. But anyway, okay. He nevertheless gets one aged 18. And really sort of, he acts incredibly quickly. That's the other thing. He very quickly is very carefully considering and wanting to put into practice commercial realities for this potential dye. So he's writing to dyers, and he's setting up a factory and starting a company all within a year. And so I think he starts building a factory to create a sort of a dye works within a year of the discovery, and 6 months later he's producing Tyrian purple, in his own factory, which again, I mean, it speaks of an incredibly strong, stubborn, and entrepreneurial spirit.
Yes, a real business sense. Yeah, business-minded as well as clever from a chemical study perspective.
Yes, absolutely. And initially he wants to link it to this Tyrian purple, and so I think they start calling it imperial purple or Tyrian purple, but very quickly he lands on the name Mauve, which comes from sort of it's a flower. Like lots of purples are actually named after flowers, like violet and lilac and all the rest of it. But Mauve comes from the name of a flower in French, and he believes this will help its kind of commercial.
So the
success.
French sort of soundingness of it, he thought would sound better than the kind of Tyrian word.
I think part of the problem was that because there had been these other attempts to make a purple dye, including from Peruvian guano, but also I think from like lichen and various other things. And so there have been kind of attempts to make, to kind of link these purples with the original Tyrian purple. So I think there was like a Roman purple, which maybe was the guano one. So actually it's kind of that naming area is a bit muddled. And so he, I think, sort of strikes out on his own striking his own path a little bit. But it's savvy to have something that sounds French, because the British, in fact, lots of countries at the time, France was the country. If you're thinking fashion, you're thinking France. And so having a French sounding name does not hurt your chances at all commercially.
And we'll get on to fashion, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
There's a portrait of then Sir William Perkin in the National Portrait Gallery, so next door to us at the National Gallery. And it is just as you described, as all the sort of most of the portraits of him are when he's older. So this is from 1906, painted by Arthur Stockdale Cope. And you can just tell from the portrait how momentous this discovery was, because when they're deciding to paint a portrait, which is now in the National Portrait Gallery of him, he is looking very
distinguished.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. Holding probably silk, I imagine, but a drape of dyed purple cloth between his hands. Very gently, actually. He looks quite, I don't know, there's an affection there, I think. And he's sort of surrounded, but behind him there's this table of conical glasses and instruments that are actually I think a little glass pot or
beaker.
Good word of the purple dye. And he's got this fantastic beard, whitish greyish beard, and his hair's all swept back, and he does look very distinguished, as you say.
In the kind of language of portraiture of the time, this really sort of says, I'm a very important man and I've made an amazing discovery.
Yes.
But when you think about the contrast between that image and actually what was going on when he actually created it, it's really striking. And I think it's a shame that there is no image of him as a teenager, because I think that would mean so much more to us today. The thought of this like precocious 18-year-old, disrupting an industry, which is exactly what he's about to do.
So now we've made this amazing discovery of Mauve, which incidentally is the title of Simon Garfield's book that we mentioned at the start. We will take a quick break and we will look at just how this mauve dye became quite so popular. We'll see you after the break. So we've met this fantastic character of William Perkin, and we need to look now at why and how mauve became quite so popular. And one of the key things was his ability eventually to mass produce this dye. So was that an easy journey? How did he go about it?
So at the time, a lot of the kind of the dyes that are available are, essentially come from natural materials. So you have a madder industry, which is using the roots of a particular plant to create red. You are using indigo plant to create blue, and weld to create yellow. Those are three really big ones. There are lots of others. And that's what dyers are familiar with for the most part. And he comes along with this dye that's completely made in a lab. And although coal tar was a byproduct of coal production, it's still reasonably expensive. And when you're doing this extraction process, it takes an awful lot of extracting to get the sort of the mauveine dye out of the coal tar. So you're taking a relatively reasonably expensive material, you're extracting it several stages further, and then you're left with a very small amount of purple dye. And so when he takes it to commercial dyers, he gets some positive noises, but there's a lot of resistance to doing things in a very different way. If all you're used to is using natural ingredients, then suddenly some 18-year-old who's never worked in dyeing and doesn't really know much about it, who's got this new chemical that they can create in a lab, there's some resistance to a very different way of doing things, and there's also the expense involved. So there's this real kind of cultural and practical resistance to what it is that he is creating. But nevertheless, he is really determined. So I've already said that he builds his dye works. He goes into business with his father and his brother almost immediately. And away he goes. He's starting to create this purple on an industrial scale. And he does have some help. There's a man called Robert Puller, who's the head of a dye works in Perth. And there's also a man called Thomas Keith, who is a silk dyer in Bethnal Green in East London. So kind of, not so far away from Perkins's own kind of stomping grounds as a child. So between their help and advice, between his own entrepreneurial spirit and this desire in Victorian England for novelty, newness, bright colours, he is able to very quickly overcome resistance and create an incredibly fashionable colour that is incredibly widely adopted and becomes so widely adopted it's almost something of a joke, as I think we'll probably discuss in a second. But it happens very, very, very fast. Within just a few years, he creates it, age 18 in 1856, and just a few years later, it is everywhere.
And even though the raw products are quite expensive and, there is quite a lot of process to go through, it is still quite competitive on the market.
So I think, he is able, with his understanding, he's able to create something commercially viable and affordable, reasonably quickly. And again, he's just operating very, very, very quickly. He's in business with, 2 family members who he trusts. And I think he's also helped by the fact that 2 very fashionable women whose clothing choices are written about and covered extensively by the press at the time adopt his colour fairly early on, which gives it a real commercial boost. And suddenly other people's resistance is overcome. But I do think there is this appetite in Victorian England and mid-19th century society more generally for newness and bright colour and something exciting and different. And so that definitely helps too.
And I guess it is a little different as well to the Tyrian purple, because Tyrian, I think, is more on the reddish end of the spectrum in terms of purples, and our new mauve is a little more on the bluish end of the spectrum. So there is that sense of newness to this very vibrant, rich purple as well.
Yeah, so it's difficult to know. We have kind of written descriptions of Tyrian purple, and they quite often compare it to kind of clotted blood, which doesn't sound all that purple to me. but there's definitely a richness. It's definitely a redness, and this is, I think, probably the British kind of cultural equivalent would be kind of Cadbury's chocolate bar purple.
Okay.
And I think maybe if you're an American, is it the Minnesota Vikings, the something Viking football team? Basketball team. My God, my sports is dreadful. Some sports team that are called the Vikings popularly appear in this kind of particular shade of purple that is much bluer than the reddish clotted blood Tyrian purple.
Okay. And you mentioned 2 women who helped make mauveine incredibly popular. Who were they and what was the impact that they had?
So the first one was the wife of Napoleon III called Empress Eugenie. And she had eyes that were kind of purplish, which I believe she was quite proud of. And so she really liked this.
Purplish eyes,
I know,
imagine.
I know, kind of amazing. I'm not too sure how purple they really were. But she believed that this colour really brought out, she believed that mauve really brought out the colour of her eyes.
Beautiful.
So she adopted it. But the other person, very familiar with a British audience was Queen Victoria, who famously wore this colour, mauve, I believe overlain with lace, to the wedding of one of her daughters. And between the 2 of them, this gets wide kind of press coverage. And the fact that these 2 women who are very prominent, and particular, the Empress is a kind of real leader of fashion and known to be very fashionable. And their association with this colour gives it this massive boost, and suddenly it is being worn by women everywhere.
And if you want to see a picture from that wedding that you mentioned, there's a painting by John Phillip from 1860 in the Royal Collection Trust, where you can see her wearing it. And the Science Museum also hold quite a few objects related to mauve, which may or may not be on display, but you can definitely look at on their website, including a small piece of silk fabric that was dyed with mauveine and supplied to Queen Victoria for a dress in about 1860. So yeah, there's plenty in British collections that you can go and explore as it relates to mauve. So from the influence of these two royal women, we get a mauve craze, a mauve trend, don't we? How does that go? What do people think about it?
I think it's really interesting looking at this time from my perspective, because I think we're quite used now to real kind of colour crazes. I remember a few years ago, I mean, when I say a few years ago, it's probably going back a decade now, but there was this real moment when millennial pink kind of became a huge thing, and suddenly everyone was talking about it. It was everywhere. It was not only was it a colour that people were wearing, it seemed to sum up this kind of cultural moment. We were thinking differently about gender. This was a colour that was worn by both men and women. It was interesting in it made people think differently about what it meant to be a woman and feminism, and whether or not there was kind of a pink tax for products that were specifically aimed at women. I think there was like a spoof about the Bic for her pens that came in pink and purple. And so you do get these moments now that people can kind of really understand, where you get a colour craze. And that's what this is, only it's happening in the late 1850s and early 1860s, when mauve takes over, or seems to, almost overnight. You get this high profile endorsement, and suddenly it's the fashionable colour, and people are dressing in it all over the place. And, popular cartoons and magazines that spoof contemporary culture are writing about it and wondering if it's become an epidemic. They call it, they coined the phrase the mauve measles.
Yes,
because,
that's in Punch magazine, wasn't it?
Exactly. Just because there's this idea that, suddenly everyone is wearing mauve in exactly the same way that, people wrote about millennial pink, or indeed Barbie pink, or any of these brat green. It's kind of similar, and it seems to say something larger about the moment. The fact that you suddenly have this royal colour that's associated with two royal women and has this association with a very old royal dye, suddenly being worn by everyone. Colour is being democratised in front of people's very eyes.
There's this great quote from Punch which says that it is spreading to so serious an extent that it is high time to consider by what means it may be checked. So they really were starting to think of it almost like as the mauve measles, as an almost disease that was spreading. So we don't see mauve featured in paintings in a sense that it was a pigment, because it wasn't, it was a dye. But we do see it represented in paintings. And so we will attempt to answer an audience question that's come in via our YouTube channel, which says, I tend to associate purple with the Impressionist painters, but did it have a significant role with other movements or particular genres? And we'll come to the Impressionists a bit later, because that story is definitely very important as it relates to purple and the history of art. But we'll look first at the pre-Raphaelites and how mauve featured in their paintings. So this is a group of English painters, poets, critics active in the mid-19th century who produced works in reaction to the Royal Academy of Arts and believed that art should be as similar to the real natural world as possible. So names that you might associate with this movement are Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who was known and was a gifted poet as well as being a painter, William Holman Hunt and John Everett Millais as well. And they showed a lot of their heroes and heroines, often painted from models, in purple-coloured costumes, didn't they? But how would they have painted them? Because presumably, although they're kind of capturing this purple trend, they're not. As we said, they're not using mauve as a pigment, because it's not. It's a dye.
Well, obviously, with purple, you can mix together blues and reds.
Yes,
and that's probably the most direct route. Purple is a really interesting colour because it does have those royal associations. It's very rich. It's very jewel toned, which are colours that you see. Those are if you think about the Pre-Raphaelite palette, it's very rich, deep, jewel toned colours that I think you're probably thinking of. And there's also this element in Pre-Raphaelite art of kind of a callback to a romantic era, kind of a forgotten poetic age maybe, and I think purple really chimes with that. So it's not too surprising that you see it cropping up in their works of art. And in a way, the sudden appearance and popularity of this new upstart industrially produced dye is runs counter to that. In a way, this idea of nature and historicism and the romantic medieval period that is sometimes evoked in the works of the Pre-Raphaelites, it seems very alien to what it was that William Henry Perkin was doing, which is disrupting the industry of natural dyes in favour of something that could be produced in a lab from coal tar, which is a very unromantic sounding and looking material.
Yeah, absolutely. So this feels like a good point for us to take a quick break, and we will come to the work of the Impressionists as we suggested after the break. So welcome back from the break, and as I said, we're going to have a look at how this mauve trend really influenced the work of the Impressionist artists. So there's a Irish writer who was working at the end of the 19th century called Oscar Wilde, and he has this amazing quote about the Impressionists, which I think gives us a sense of their work, which says, "That white, quivering sunlight that one sees now in France, with its strange blotches of mauve and its restless violet shadows, is art's latest fancy. And on the whole, nature reproduces it quite admirably. Where she used to give us Corot's and d'Aubigny's, she now gives us exquisite Monets and entrancing Pissarros." So that's from The Decade of Lying in 1891 by Oscar Wilde. Famous playwright and writer working in the 1880s and 90s. And that does really give us the sense, doesn't it, of a painting that we're going to look at by Claude Monet from our collection called Irises, and the popularity of mauve, again, as we say, not as a pigment in it of itself, but on the impact of mauve in painting.
It was a real critique of the Impressionists. When the Impressionists began emerging, their preference for purple was something that really struck critics, and both good and bad. Lots of people thought that the Impressionist painters had some kind of visual impairment, that they'd been working outside so much that their eyesight had been affected by the brightness of the sun.
Really?
And people accused them of having violetomania.
Yes.
Because they were painting so much with purple, but for them they thought it was a real natural a natural way of depicting shadow, because the sun is usually depicted as yellowy orange, and so shadows should have some purple, and they talked about it quite openly, their use of purple, their preference for purple.
Yes.
And they believed that there should be more purple and violet out there in the world and in painting, but it was something that really struck contemporaries at the time, both for good and ill. People thought they'd lost their minds.
It's really interesting, isn't it, how purple has been pathologized both in the fashion trend and clothing and in painting as well, with the mauve measles and then this violet mania.
Yeah, there does seem to be sort of an association of madness, or kind of, maybe not madness, but maybe, a kind of loop of getting swept up by it, of getting, so caught up and so enthusiastic that you lose your kind of true sense of kind of sensible north. If that's a way of putting it, there does seem to be this idea that purple can drive you out of your senses.
We do see it as very characteristic, don't we, of the Impressionists when you think of them. As you said, in the shadows, they didn't tend to use like a pure black. They would use chromatic blacks, so they would build up colours through things like purples. And this painting, Irises, that I mentioned by Monet, painted in about 1914 to 17, is one of about 20 views of irises that he painted in the water garden that he constructed and built in his garden. And by the 19th century, hybridization had created almost 200 different varieties of iris. I know that Monet had tons and tons of these kind of gardening and plant books and brochures that he procured his plants through. And so we've got this kind of fascination with plants, and particularly with irises that have all these different colours, but they are very kind of violet-y, lilac-y, mauve in this painting, aren't they?
I think by this time, Monet famously, his eyesight was pretty poor. He had cataracts, and his eyesight progressively got worse as he got older. And so, really late on in his career, his eyesight had deteriorated to such an extent that he was almost relying on his memory of what pigments he had and what they looked like, rather than actually being able to see them. And then he would paint these fantastical views of his garden that he'd created that was sort of almost an extension of his art. And the fact that there are so many purples in there, I think is really amazing. And I also think it's incredible that purple crops up so much in these later works of art when his eyesight was really impaired, and he's working on, kind of memory both of what his garden looked like, but also memory of what his own artist materials were like.
It's very poignant, isn't it? The pigments he uses in this painting are ultramarine, so a rich blue, and cobalt violet. So those have been identified by our scientific department in cross sections of the painting, and they create those mauve shades. And yes, this painting sort of has a snaking greenish garden path going through the irises. It's sort of from a bird's eye view. So we're looking down on these sort of almost banks or clusters of iris plants. The paint is applied in really thick, bold, striking brushstrokes in these purples and blues and greens. Just beautiful. And Monet also uses a mauve colour in his water lilies paintings as well. So you can see some of those in our collection. Now, we've talked about how mauve became and has become so popular, but did it eventually fall out of fashion and popularity past the 19th century?
Yeah, I think there is something about, if I was a colour, I would never want to have a real peak of popularity. I always feel quite sorry for colours that become incredibly fashionable. It's a bit like songs that get played too much on the radio. I think people just sort of get sick and tired of them and fall out of love with them, and then they disappear for ages because people are just sick of them and they become so associated with a particular moment in time. And that's definitely something that happens to mauveine and mauve. The other thing is that because the creation of mauveine has opened up this entire new avenue of aniline dyes that, proves incredibly fruitful. New dyes are being created all the time, and people are getting really kind of caught up in the latest blue or green or yellow or orange or red or black or whatever colour it is that's coming out of, the factories this week. I think there's a story about the kind of regular frequenters of a pub that was just down the canal from William Henry Perkins' factory in Harrow, and they said that they could tell what colour was going to be the next fashion because the canal water would turn whichever colour it was that they were working on in the dye works that month. But you do get this kind of, steep drop off in popularity for mauve. It's had its time. It's been incredibly fashionable. People have caught the mauve measles and then swiftly recovered. But I think Oscar Wilde is himself in a part of that story, because Oscar Wilde is incredibly influential in his tastes, and does huge sort of speaking tours through America, and talks about which colours that he really likes and which colours he doesn't, and he is a real fan of purple and wears it quite often. And then you have this kind of spectacular downfall and scandal, and I think that is one of the reasons why there's kind of a shift a little bit away from purple, and purple begins to become really associated with homosexuality and scandal, and that contributes to a kind of a lessening of popularity of purple at this time.
Interestingly, he also wrote himself in his very famous 1890 novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, never trust a woman who wears mauve, whatever her age may be, or a woman over 35 who is fond of pink ribbons. It always means they have a history. So there's some sense even of him perhaps turning away from purple as well.
I love the idea of a woman having a history as something untrustworthy, as if women should be created entirely newly every moment.
So yes, it falls out of fashion in the fashion / textile industry, but mauve really has kickstarted something, and so its impact and Perkins's impact is hugely wide ranging, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. And I think although you do see mauve itself becoming less fashionable, and you do have these associations that come out, particularly at the very end of the 19th century, between homosexuality and purple, and this idea of it being this kind of negative association it has with homosexuality at the time. You still have this great cultural affection for it, and this deeper layer of meaning of its association with royalty and with this incredibly, defining purple dye, Tyrian purple. So that lingers on, and that remains, and still people can kind of call back to that even now.
Definitely. And that's why we have this portrait that we're going to talk about to close the episode with, which is Oprah Winfrey's portrait. And this was painted by Sean Michael Warren, commissioned by the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. And as you might expect from the episode that we are in, she's standing in a very striking purple taffeta dress, surrounded by 12 interwoven oak trees. And I think that does speak to our kind of royal, fashionable associations with purple, that they've chosen to depict her in purple here.
Yeah, it's a colour of power. And I think particularly seeing it in such a rich fabric, and seeing, so much of it, it's a statement gown that she's wearing. It's beautiful, very rich colour. And, it does have this association with power, with splendour. It's an eye-catching colour. It's unignorable. And I think that's something that she's calling to in this portrait. It's a statement.
Absolutely. I think also can be linked to the significance of Alice Walker's novel, The Colour Purple from 1982, which I think Oprah has spoken about. But there's a line in the novel which a character says, "I think it pisses God off if you walk by the colour purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it." And Oprah herself has been quoted as saying, "The colour purple, and noticing it to me, is the essence of what God represents, the complications of making the colour purple and the simplicity of appreciating it." And so I think that's probably a good place for us to close.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming back and joining us for today's episode of Stories in Colour. So if you at home want to explore more about the science of colour and how art materials are made, you can look us up on YouTube for the National Gallery's YouTube channel. And if you've got more questions about the story of colour and how this amazing technology has interacted with human history, you can email us on podcast@nationalgallery.org.uk. Most of all, we just hope that you will subscribe and come back to listen to more of these episodes of our podcast series, Stories in Colour. So thank you so much for joining us today, with massive thanks to our guest, Kassia St Clair. I've been your host, Beks Leary. Our producer was Harry Rosehill. Our researcher was Hannah Rogers. Our technicians were Ian Warren and Timothy Carpenter. Our video editor was Shan Kenyon. And our scientific advisor was Nellie von Adekas. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.